talking about the fact that The Invisible Landscape was just reissued.
Yes, I'm glad to see it out. I think it's my best thing. I think it's our best thing.
Really?
Yeah.
And
for people who don't know, that was Terence and his brother Dennis both wrote that book originally in the mid-'70s, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. And maybe we should talk about the book in a little bit, because I think for the benefit of the audience here listening for the first time to you speak, maybe we should sort of have a few questions that are probably pretty general and probably often asked to you, but I think they're still pretty appropriate and necessary questions nonetheless. So if you don't mind, we'll dive right in.
No, please, have at it.
Okay. So, well, one thing that comes up all the time is the fact that, well, let's just say briefly that your whole deal is talking about the usage of psychedelics. And I guess I should let you do an overview of that, but one big question that comes up a lot is the difference between, well, people will say, why do people have to do psychedelics to, achieve some kind of altered state of consciousness or some other way of seeing the world, when there are other tried methods that have been around for thousands of years, such as meditation or breathing techniques, to achieve those same states?
Well, I notice you called those methods tried. You didn't call them tried and true.
Well, that's right.
I tried them, and they weren't so true.
Right.
The problem is that these other techniques are nowhere near as effective in terms of the amount of time you have to spend with them or how deep you go. I've never really understood the fascination with achieving these things on the natch. It's, to me, quite reassuring to know that these effects are being caused by a plant or a substance, and that when it metabolizes out of my body, I will return to my ordinary baseline of consciousness. These are not states of mind that we're trying to homestead in the sense of go and live there. They're too radical. They're too transcendental for that. These are not just simple alterations of ordinary consciousness, but actual journeys into titanic, dynamic, previously unimagined dimensions, and the fact that one can get there at all is astonishing. The demand that one be able to get there without pharmacological assistance seems to me perverse.
It's interesting. Terence, this is Rusty Hoover. You may remember me as the sound man.
I can barely hear you.
This is Rusty Hoover. You may remember me as the sound man at the Open Center over the last couple of years. It's interesting that you say you find it reassuring that you're taking a psychoactive plant, because that's exactly, it's the opposite. People's worry is the opposite of that. That they find it reassuring that they're doing it on the natch and not from some plant. You're 180 degrees from that.
Well, yes, because I assume that if the plant is the sine qua non, as we say, in other words, the thing without which it won't work, then you always know how to get back to ground control. If you do it on the natch, you may find it very difficult to get back to anything that you can identify as normality.
Interesting.
So it's the operational control as well as the effectiveness that makes the plant so attractive.
This sort of brings up a statement you made at one of your talks in the past. I don't remember what actual workshop it was that you gave this at, but you said, and I quote, "The core experience of the tryptamine hallucinogens is a paradigm-confounding encounter with another order of organized intelligence that is in some other dimension that is potentially cotangent to this world." Well, that's certainly a mouthful, but could you first, for those who may not know, explain what a tryptamine hallucinogen is? And then if you could elaborate on the statement a little bit, because I think it's fundamental to what you're talking about when you talk about this other intelligence that you encounter when you're in that state.
Well, first of all, what is a tryptamine hallucinogen? It's a psychoactive compound in this limited chemical family related to serotonin. So that would be DMT, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT. These are the naturally occurring tryptamine hallucinogens. And what's interesting, among other things, about them, especially DMT, is that it occurs naturally in human metabolism. It's the only psychedelic compound known to do that, really. I mean, there are some quibbles, but so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about tryptamine hallucinogens. This family occurs in human beings, occurs more commonly in nature than any other type of hallucinogen, and yet, and this addresses the other half of your question, when the human experience of these things is an experience of the transformation of consciousness and category that is so profound and overwhelming to most people that you have to describe it as a kind of apotheosis. In other words, it seems to have all the earmarks of a deep mystical ecstasy and revelation of hidden orders of existence, the classical spark plug for religions and religious experience. So I'm very interested in this because DMT is apparently quite harmless. Almost anyone who has access to the compound can achieve the states I'm describing, and yet very little is known about it. It's very little discussed in a world mad for thrills of every sort. This, nevertheless, is somehow passed by. So I, as a philosopher, student of the human experience, so forth and so on, I'd like to know why. I'd like to know what culture would be like if it were informed by the values and insights that seem to reside in that other dimension.
Well, this sort of brings up the issue of like whether or not you're when you talk about the other and you talk about going into that state, you have stated that you're making contact with some kind of alien being or some kind of other intelligence, right? But others would argue that, including your brother, in a recent interview.
I think I have the quote right here,
yeah.
Fabio. Terence, your brother has critiqued you a bit on this point about the other. I think he said that he made a statement that psychedelics are not about getting in touch with aliens, they're about getting in touch with the self. And I think he also claimed that you've either lost sight of that or decided to overlook that. What do you respond to that? I know this is a critique you get a lot from people at your talks.
Well, I enjoy discussing these things with Dennis, whether in person or merely in the third person. When he says that it's not about getting in touch with aliens, it's getting in touch with the self, he's using the self in a very self-conscious way. He's using it the way a Jungian analyst would use the word the self. Uh-huh. And if you've read Jung on this subject, you know that the self is not, it's the repository of all mystery. In other words, to say that something is the self is not to have solved the problem or illuminated what it is. You've simply indicated that its source is completely mysterious. I agree with him completely. The self is the mystery, and any contact with aliens or with the woman you're sleeping with is going to be mediated through the self. The self stands in the first position. I don't think there is any great difference between Dennis and I on these positions, although I agree that it often sounds like it. I enjoy putting us together privately or in public because the debate that he and I have over the epistemic foundations of these ideas is a microcosm of the debate I would like to see go on in society about just these precise issues.
Well, I think essentially what the problem is that people take you too literally.
Yes, they take me too literally, and they also presume to understand. I just, you mentioned at the beginning of the program that Invisible Landscape is back in print. Invisible Landscape, which is our deepest statement on these things, is an incredibly dense and complicated manifesto of some sort. I mean, I personally am in awe of it. So the notion of, what is exactly meant here, I view my career and Dennis's career as pointers toward a new style of thinking about mind and organism and pharmacology that combines the rigor of science with the imaginative sweep of natural magic. And I don't, there are no secure findings yet in this field, but both from spending a lot of time with shamans in their neighborhood and a lot of time loaded on psychedelics, I'm convinced that if people will diligently explore these areas, there will be big payoff for psychology, epistemology, art, and a general amelioration of the human condition. And that's just my personal conviction. A conviction is something that seems obvious to you, so you can't explain it to other people.
That leads me a little bit into this next question. You've said many times that the pro-psychedelic position is, in fact, an anti-drug position. Now, when I tell people this, they're baffled by it. I mean, I understand it, but could you sort of lay out that idea, what that's all about?
Sure. The reason I said the pro-psychedelic position is an anti-drug position is because I've, been around the block. I've spent time with junkies, and other styles of drug abuse are familiar to me. And I believe that what people find offensive about drug abuse is self-destructive, repetitive, unconscious behavior.
Right.
And that this is what we all are repelled by. Self-destructive, unconscious, repetitive behavior. Well, that could mean shooting junk into your good right arm, but it could mean watching TV 6 hours a day.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, psychedelics do not promote self-destructive, repetitive, unconscious behavior. Quite the opposite. They break up patterns of activity, promote self-perspective, self-evaluation. I think anybody who's spent time in the quote-unquote drug culture has had experiences of friends of theirs, or perhaps they themselves, undergoing dramatic personality reconstruction because of the impact of high-dose psychedelic trips. I mean, this is, in my experience, about the only way that people ever undergo dramatic, long-term, overnight change. Right. I mean, that and automobile accidents.
The book, The Invisible Landscape, is sort of all about the time wave zero stuff, and
right.
I know that's a maybe that's a whole day's workshop that you give, that discussion, but could you lay that out a little bit?
Just an encapsulation.
I hear the anxiety in your
Such a thing is possible.
No, not at all, but I know that it's a long-winded thing, so...
It's a long-winded thing. Basically what it is I had one original idea in my whole life, which was, and it came out of psychedelics, definitely, which was that time could actually be described through the use of a fractal equation. And I, with the help of friends, have programmed this into a computer, and we have, in fact, produced an arguable approach toward modeling history, including the future. And you're right, it's a day-long workshop, and it's unfair to expect radio audiences coming cold to this stuff to follow. But it's what I care most about. I do this public advocacy of psychedelics because it's politically correct to do so, and no one else seems to want the job. My private passion as an intellectual lies in this much more nerdish, mathematical, computer-assisted dimension, but it's not something you can shout about from 4 feet behind the footlights.
Okay, well, so we'll move on to another question.
I just want to, it makes me think a little bit, you've talked a lot about this incredible book by Jean Gebser, The Ever-Present Origin. And isn't that book sort of all about time?
It is, and so a more important book to my thinking, and probably period, is Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is the psychedelic metaphysic. You can throw away your Sanskrit dictionaries, folks. Alfred North Whitehead, in very good English and on mathematically impeccable foundations, created the most psychedelic philosophy there is, I think.
I have another quote that I'm going to throw out at you that you've stated in the past. That is that you've said, the world is made of language. And I've always been curious about this statement because I've heard it in the past by others as well. You know, just it's something that's been around. And I'm curious to know more about your take on this.
Well, the older statement is, I think English is a virus from outer space. That's a slightly different perception. The world is made of language. In other words, if you ask a scientist what is the world made of, he will tell you it's made of electrons and force fields and this sort of thing. But notice that these are all words, and that behind these words stand the deeper languages of mathematics. Whatever the world really is, what we experience and what we communicate to each other is entirely couched within the medium of language. So language is the primary determinant of the experience of being. And science has chosen to be very naive about this. It's only in the 20th century that these issues have even been raised. Before that, before quantum physics, scientists blithely believed that they were observing an independent reality that their observations had no effect on. Since quantum physics, we now know that there is, a much more complicated situation prevailing, that mind somehow is a necessary ingredient in the becoming of the world, and that this becoming of the world, whatever it is for itself, for mind, it is something which happens in the domain of language.
I guess everything is filtered through, everything goes through language, no matter whether it's scientific or what it is.
And in going through language, it takes upon itself the character of language and leaves behind much of the character of whatever it was before that. Wittgenstein talked about the unspeakable. This is what he was referring to, this dimension antecedent to language, and it is unspeakable.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of speaking of something now, I got this other impression in my mind, so I'm going to move on to something else just quickly. You were scheduled to play in New York last Monday at Irving Plaza, and it got canceled. You want to talk a little bit about that? What happened?
Well, there's no, story in the ordinary sense. Frankly, I don't know what happened. I think it just was undersubscribed, or the publicity was badly handled.
I don't think they promoted it, right?
Yeah.
That was what I heard. Anyway, the word came back down through the great hierarchy of managers and producers that it was canceled, my attitude toward these things is, so you lose money, you gain time.
Right. Well, but you've been doing a lot more of this sort of thing, talking at raves. You came out with these 2 records with Space-Time Continuum and The Shaman, and what was the other one?
Dream Matrix.
Yeah, and so in the last couple of years, you've been out there sort of more in the public eye than you have in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, although you've done these more sort of traditional things at Esalen and the Open Center and places like that. But now it seems you're branching out into a more public arena. And I wonder, do you see, the ultimate danger in that, that, say, fell upon, well, I don't want to put you in the same camp, but, people like Leary and...
you're spreading the word to the masses now.
Well, yes... a couple, 3 years ago, I was doing one of my, as you say, more ordinary gigs, but I was doing it in London, and Fraser Clark, now of Megatripolis fame, brought his posse to see me, and there was a natural affinity between myself and the house rave techno gang in England. And so I started doing raves, and I did them in England, and I did them in Frankfurt, and then eventually I did a couple of them here.
Oh, you have done some in New York already?
Well, by here I meant I've done them on the West Coast.
Right. Not in New York yet, though.
Right.
Right.
And I sort of fell into it simply because I guess I'm more comfortable with a younger crowd. I like the optimism. Before this, my crowd was basically like myself, old freaks. But now there seems to be a rising under 30 group that's very interested in psychedelics and not cynical about spirituality in the same way that the industrial noise and punk crowds were. So there is actually... now been created a social space where people 24 to 26 years old can speak a vocabulary of spiritual seeking and not be unhip. It's a very optimistic, eco-conscious, psychedelic kind of thing that's developed in England around these clubs, around the raves, and it's coming here. And I gravitate toward it because I think these are the people who are listening to me say take 5 grams in silent darkness on an empty stomach and actually doing it, and it's changing their lives. So I appreciate that because that's what I wanted. I want a public debate about the psychedelic experience based on people having had it.
Mm-hmm. You think the younger rave crowd might be more likely to do that than the older crowd?
Well, I think the older crowd feels like you only have to pay your dues once, and they went to the barricades in the 60s, right. And that was it.
Hey, what are some of the interesting legal psychedelics? I mean, there are some out there, right?
Well, there are some out there. I suppose the most interesting at the moment is this compound alpha salvorine, or salvorine alpha, which comes from Salvia divinorum, which has just been really discovered or
that's a plant, right?
It's a plant recognized in the past 6 months, and this is active in microgram quantities.
Oh, wow.
500 micrograms. You smoke it, and it's not a relative of any of the known psychedelics. And for 45 minutes, it creates a very profound transformation of reality.
Well, that sounds like the hot one, then.
Well, the fact that it's legal,
yeah.
You see, is very, very interesting. And I'm hopeful that rather than just schedule it without any review of the evidence, that at this point in the evolution of the drug debate, if the government wants to schedule this compound, they should at least do research with human subjects and show why it should be scheduled. Simply scheduling it on the grounds that it intoxicates means it is out front then that the whole thing is a witch hunt and that there is no public health issue or any other issue involved. It's just an effort to suppress interesting states of mind not sanctioned by the state.
So to do that, they would sort of expose themselves by doing that.
Yeah.
Although they've never showed a willingness not to.
They never submitted evidence that psilocybin had any detrimental effects on human beings. It was just caught up in the hysteria about LSD.
Exactly.
Hey, what do you think people can do to... I mean, it seems like people are always eager to do anything they can to change these stupid laws and the stupid drug war and everything and all the negative ideas about psychedelics. I mean, can you give advice to those folks out there who want to do something about this big problem?
About the whole suppression of psychedelics thing? Well, I think, like black people, like gay people, you just have to come out of the closet and say to people around us on a fairly tentative basis, I do this. It's part of my life. I pay taxes. I hold down a job, and yes, I take LSD, or the society is not clear thinking about drugs. I mean, for example, look at the NRA, for example. You see these bumper stickers which say, guns don't cause crime. Well, but why doesn't the bumper sticker then say, and illegal drugs do, therefore I support legalization of all drugs? The NRA, if they're serious about hanging on to their guns, better carry through on their analysis of where the cause of crime lies and get with the rest of us and get a sane drug policy in place. But I don't hear that from them.
Hey, it's the top of the hour, and I'm just going to do an ID here. This is WFMU, Uppsala College in East Orange. I'm Fabio, and my co-host is Rusty, and we're talking with Terence McKenna live here. He's on the West Coast. Where exactly are you on the West Coast?
I'm north of San Francisco, an hour and a half in the wine country.
Hey, there's one thing that we haven't said. We haven't said at all that Terence is going to be here very soon.
That's right.
A week from tomorrow night, in fact.
Do you want to just briefly explain what you do in your workshops?
Well, yes. I mean, I review the psychoactive plant usage complexes around the world and share technical and trade data, talk about the impact of psychedelics on human culture and evolution, describe the phenomenology of these states, talk about what they might mean for the culture crisis that we're in, invite people to put in their 2 cents worth, and talk about the time wave. Mm-hmm. It's basically just a freewheeling survey of this psychedelic end of the millennium techno-shamanic stuff. I mean, I'm part of a certain meme that's loose in society, and I can talk about it.
I'm just curious, has any of your recent work with either the time wave or any other research you've done with the psychedelics led you to any new insights that we haven't heard from you yet?
What's the next book?
Well,
you're probably going to relax
I don't know what you've heard from me. I have thought a lot recently about, strangely enough, real-world solutions to some of our problems, and I've been talking recently about what I call the one woman, one child option. Have we ever talked about that?
No.
Well, that's the observation that if every woman would have only one child, the population of the planet would fall 50% in 40 years. And backed by the further observation that a child born in the first world uses 800 to 1,000 times more resources than a child born in the third world. Therefore, the women who could have the most impact on the global crisis by limiting themselves to one child are first world women, who are the most educated, the most ecologically aware population of women on the planet. In other words, they should be easy to convert. So I've been talking to people about how we imagine our problems are insoluble, but here's a social policy which would completely put a brake on the most damaging social problems.
Yeah, but how would you get something like that off the ground? I mean,
well, you would put in tax and insurance incentives, and you would promise cradle to the grave health care for any woman who did this, and no income tax, and on and on and on. Whatever you had to do.
The almighty dollar.
Yes. And then the other thing I've been thinking about, which is yet more radical and bound to spawn heated and boisterous debate, I suppose, is this whole issue about dominator culture and the suppression of women and the presence of the patriarchy and so forth and so on. Well, I say then, following through with the idea of an archaic reconstruction of society, I believe that in archaic society, the ratio of men to women was more like 70 to 30%, and that one of the artifacts of the patriarchy is an artificially high male birth rate, and that we can't, nor should we wish, to feminize men. That's insulting to masculinity. But if we want to feminize society, there should just be fewer men. So let's push for a 70-30 ratio, and with those same tax and insurance and medical policies, using amniocentesis and so forth, discourage the birth of male babies for a while. A world 40 years from now with half as many people and 3 times as many women is the world we're trying to create. You see, there's nothing wrong with being a man or a woman, but the values as a species that we now need to live on this planet are feminine values: nurturing, caring, mothering, attention to detail, so forth and so on. Not to knock the male values, which got us to this very brilliant and opportunistic place.
So you think there's a good chance that the world could be a lot less warlike with more feminine values?
Surely.
Yeah, except when you have people like Margaret Thatcher around, you know.
Well, I see Margaret Thatcher as a spear carrier for the patriarch. She had more balls than any of them.
Right.
If there were fewer people in the world, we could all do cryonics and live in suspended animation and come back 100 years from now.
Well, if there were fewer people in the world, we wouldn't have to. It doesn't take too much intelligence to see that if there were half as many people, we'd be, on average, twice as wealthy.
Well, it seems like, a lot of the things you've talked about in the past are starting to happen. The 90s look like they're just going to get progressively worse to me. And, when you talk about, the shadow at the end of time. No,
the transcendental.
The transcendental.
Man.
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to begin, to like see that there's going to be something happen. I don't know when it's going to happen or what, but there definitely feels like something's in the air.
Moving towards something.
Yes, I mean, hundreds of thousands of computers a week are connecting up and switching on. This new youth culture is marching forward. These people who are 20 now will be 40 in 2012. My generation, which is now coming into whatever power it will ever have, will have completely consolidated that power in 20 years. The other thing that's driving all this is the absolutely freakish evolution of technology, where we have hardware we don't even know how to program. We haven't yet figured out what to do with stuff that is sitting around gathering dust. It's not that we have to invent things we don't have. We just have to figure out how to apply what we do have. And this is all, thousands of people in laboratories and think tanks are pursuing their own minuscule part of the puzzle. But the sum total of all this activity is the cultural leap into hyperspace. It's happening.
Well, one big thing I have when I think about you and your raps is what you talk about is, to say the least, highly controversial and can cause a lot of arguments and problems. And I wonder how you've been able to avoid, serious problems, meaning with law and things like that, and official agencies bugging you and giving you a hard time, because this was a big problem for some of the pro-psychedelic people in the 60s, and, what happened to them, and,
Well, it was a very different situation. I mean, I came up through the 60s. I was just there. I was a nobody, but I recall being at rallies where Tim Leary spoke to 100,000 people. Well, I've never spoken to more than 2,000 or 3,000 people. The other thing is, the war gave the government, in its own mind, carte blanche to do anything it wanted to. The other thing was LSD, by the fact that a single chemist can produce enough doses to get 10 million people high, was actually an instrument capable of threatening the destinies of national governments. Releasing 10 million hits of a psychedelic drug doesn't mean you want to get the dorm high or even that you want a Ferrari. It means that you're some kind of social force to be reckoned with. I've always advocated mushroom growing because I think mushrooms are a more interesting experience, but also no mushroom grower can produce more than a few thousand hits at most over a period of months. And so it doesn't build criminal pyramids of vast and frenzied dealing activity. It's more a strategy of stealth and penetration.
Well, I mean, but that depends. I mean, you talk about mushroom, but what if somebody got into, say, mass-producing DMT, which can be done?
Well, it can't be done on the scale of LSD.
Right.
I mean, because, see, you need 50 milligrams of DMT for a dose. If you had 50 milligrams of LSD, that would be 500 hits of LSD.
Right.
To make a huge amount of DMT, you would have to commandeer a chemical factory with huge stainless steel vats and very precise temperature controls, and it's quite a daunting operation. I mean, if you want to produce a few ounces of DMT, that a skilled amateur can do, but metric tons are a whole other story.
Well, so...
You want to take some phone calls? I don't have any more major questions.
We were thinking about having you field some questions from our audience. Are you into that?
Sure, I'll go to the bottom of the hour.
The number here is 201-678-7743 if anyone has a pertinent question. Let's see.
And by the way, we should just say that the talk a week from tomorrow night is going to be at the Julia Richmond High School at 217 East 67th Street, I believe it is, in Manhattan. That's between 1st and 2nd Avenues, and that's Friday the 29th at 8 p.m., I believe. Yeah, 8 p.m. Are you going to be talking about anything specific at that, or is it going to be one of your general talks on this stuff?
I imagine the fair answer is it'll be general. I mean, I am extemporizing. I do not really prepare. I feel like the audience brings an agenda, the daily newspaper sets the tone, and what I just smoked puts in the coloration.
Right.
We should also mention the Aldous Huxley tribute, which is the very next night, Saturday the 30th.
And I'll be participating in that too, and a bunch of other folks, and that's really an important thing.
Yeah, we're going to be giving away some tickets for both of those talks in a little while. And
that's at the same place, at the Julia Richmond High School. And then, of course, there's the workshop that weekend, which will be Saturday and Sunday at the Open Center itself.
Okay, let's put some phone callers on.
Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, how you guys doing?
Okay.
Terrence.
Yeah,
how are you? I'm really excited about a lot of things that happen with the rave culture in England and in here. But I've got a really, I have a real problem, and I don't know if you're probably familiar with Alan Watts, right?
Speak up a little bit.
Yeah, sure. What I wanted to say is that I think that people self-medicating themselves with psychedelics is extremely dangerous.
Why?
And what I think it can lead to is drug abuse. I think drug abuse, not drug use, I think can really lead to a fascist state of mind, particularly in a movement sense. I think that self-medication of psychedelics is extraordinarily dangerous, and I think no matter how good our intentions are, people are going to abuse these drugs.
Do you think it's dangerous? Do you mean physically dangerous or socially?
I think it's spiritually dangerous.
In the sense that a person doing
well,
this...
in the sense that it's like an amplifier. You know, it's you plug a guitar in and you turn it up, and if you don't know how to play it, you're going to create a lot of horrible noise. And I think that's a very close analogy. People are not going to... They're going to be following a trend. They're not going to understand. They're not going to understand with spiritual values. And I think that, I mean, we saw it in the 60s. I mean, we saw it, you know.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, in some sense, I agree with you. I think that what the answer is to educate people, because they're not going to not do it. So what you have to do is say, look, for thousands of years, people have been doing these things, but in a certain way. And so you don't do it in crowded social situations in the presence of pounding music and strangers. You do it in secure environments, in darkness, with a firm intention to learn something. This is how it's done in traditional societies, and I think if people will do it that way and stay away from their automobiles, obviously, in the process, that it can have a positive effect.
I understand exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you. And I think that that's what happened with a lot of the Harvard tests in the early 60s and things like that. But what happens, and what I think is inevitably going to happen, is that it's going to spread, and how you're going to deal with it. Because what's going to happen is that when it spreads and things are handled improperly, which I think a lot of times is inevitable, because, you know, the more people involved, the less easy it is to control. I mean, people like yourself are going to be held accountable for negative effects. You see what I'm saying? And I spoke with Dr. Leary about this at a symposium I went to, and he didn't seem terribly receptive. I mean, he's like a cheerleader, you know. And I was very concerned that he didn't seem to see the downside of things. You know what I'm saying? And I think that we have a responsibility as human beings, as spiritual beings, to see the downside of things.
Well,
even if we don't
want
to acknowledge them, we have to deal with them, or they will deal with us.
Yes, I think this is why you cannot say enough that the key is education. It's just like sexuality. You can't just turn people loose in an era of fatal epidemics. People have to be told, and I would tell them in high school. I mean, drugs are here to stay, more arriving every day, all kinds of drugs, not simply psychoactive drugs. And people should be told that part of growing up in the new millennium is pharmacological sophistication, and that the people who aren't getting the message, we build cemeteries for those people, just like we build cemeteries for people who aren't getting the message about how you handle an automobile correctly. Automobiles, drugs, computers. Apparently a collective decision has been made that these things shall join us in our world. And those who aren't willing to make the effort to learn how to integrate their lives in the presence of these things are going to fall by the wayside. It's always been like this with every human adaptation.
Okay, thanks to that caller. Let's take one more.
You're on the air.
Hi. I wanted to ask Terence, what do you have to say to people who are in a recovery program, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, who still find your ideas intriguing, but have to abstain or have chosen to abstain from mind-altering chemicals?
Well, I believe that what we're talking about when we're talking about psychedelics is the imagination. And anybody who is in a recovery program probably knows quite a bit about drugs and psychedelics. I'm not saying that life without drugs is unbearable. I'm saying life without knowing that these places exist is somewhat unbearable. A person may have a period of heavy drug use and then pull out of it. But what they shouldn't deny is that there were aspects of that were important to them, or they wouldn't have been doing it. I've talked to people very high up in AA, and they're very approving of the point made earlier in this program that psychedelics interrupt habitual behavior. People who manage to get screwed up on psychedelics really have a strong attraction to being screwed up, I think. The way to do psychedelics and stay out of trouble is do them rarely and at high doses. It's when people start using, for instance, LSD like speed, and they say, well, we'll just take 50 mics, you know.
A lot of people used to do that.
Well, people do it a lot these days. Well, and then they think they know something about LSD. They know nothing about LSD if they're taking it at 50 mics, and they are diddling with the possibility of getting psychologically hooked on the feeling of speed.
And if they're taking it every day, they're building up a tolerance.
And they're building up a tolerance, and the tolerance comes first to the psychedelic effects and last to the speed effects. So, again, it's about being sophisticated. I mean, if somebody brings me a new drug or a new plant, my first stop is the database, the library. You want to know. And I've taken everything I felt was safe, and I've never been particularly strung out on anything, but I keep moving. I present a moving target. I'm interested in reality. And to people who've passed through drugs and are still interested in my ideas and reality, there's all kinds of edges to be run. It's not simply a glorification of drugs. It's a glorification of the creative imagination.
How do you feel about, I have another question myself, how do you feel about the position that some of the other people in the psychedelic community, as it's called, take sort of a different stance than you, that, you know, because you say that certain things, if they're going to be psychedelic, if you're going to take them, certain drugs,